there are a couple of features that are common to a lot of history's arms races. They can be easy to start, hard to stop, and incinerate cash with the kind of zeal you'd normally associate with venture capital during a tech bubble. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about a country that demonstrates that effect in action. The North African nation of Algeria, which, according to CIPRI, is managing to shovel a greater percentage of its GDP into the defence spending furnace during peacetime than Russia officially is during wartime. What we didn't cover in that episode, though, were the details of one of the countries that might be most concerned by that breakneck pace build-up. The neighbouring kingdom of Morocco hasn't had formal diplomatic relations with Algeria since 2021. It stood on opposite sides of multiple geopolitical issues, chosen different friends internationally, adopted a different system of government, and amidst a variety of disputes and tensions that stretch back many, many years, they probably have a fairly strong incentive to try and counterbalance any build-up by Algiers. The key problem, from a defence economic standpoint, is how to do it. In that sense, Morocco is different from a lot of the other countries we've looked at on the channel. Most of them tend to be relatively wealthy, industrialised countries with a lot of resources available to spend on defence, with the main challenge being spending it efficiently. But Morocco, with a smaller population, a smaller economy, and less GDP dedicated to defence, just isn't in a position to match Algiers dollar for dollar. Meaning that Moroccan defence policy is often a story of hard procurement choices, difficult decisions, and a need to prioritise. Which, from a defence economics perspective, sounds like an interesting kind of story to me. And so today, for the second time on the channel, welcome to North Africa. For the most part, the video is going to follow the same structure we did with Algeria. We'll set up some strategic context and history first, then look at Morocco's existing armed forces, and in doing that, ask 3 critical questions. How does the existing force compare to the Algerian one? Where are the potential capability gaps? And what has Morocco been investing in to try and close those gaps? Then, towards the end, we'll zoom out for some broader observations, looking at economic sustainability, the difference between the Algerian and Moroccan approach, and ultimately what we might expect to happen next. And so, with all that said, let's start by meeting today's protagonists. This is Morocco, a North African nation of approximately 38 million people, and resident of a fairly interesting neighbourhood. In terms of land borders connecting to its claimed territory, Morocco has good relations with Mauritania to the south, very much not good relations with Algeria to the east, and an it's complicated relationship with Spain to the north. And yes, I did say Spain to the north, because thanks to 2 small Spanish enclaves with a combined population of around 170,000, Morocco actually has 2 very small land borders with the European Union. As is often the case with strange borders around the world, these ones come with some history behind them. The Portuguese conquered the city of Ceuta in 1415, while the Spanish crown would later take Melilla. Now, during this era, the Spanish and Portuguese crowns come into a personal union where they're both held by the same individual. That union eventually breaks down in 1688, but in the divorce proceedings, Spain manages to keep the Portuguese city as well. With about 400 years of rule behind them and the demographics in those cities skewing European, Madrid would ultimately retain these 2 cities even after Morocco became fully independent in 1956. Morocco publicly maintains a claim to both of them, but for years the status quo has prevailed, and the issue hasn't been enough to stop Morocco developing a very close trade relationship with Europe. In 2023, the EU actually took a strict majority of all of Morocco's exports, with Spain being the single most important destination, and it also provided nearly half of the country's imports. If you compare the Moroccan economy and its trading relationships with that of Algeria to the east, you'll see an economy that is at the same time smaller and also more diverse. With a lot of that coming down to one defining strategic difference between Morocco and its regional competitor, unlike Algeria, Morocco doesn't have oil and gas, instead being highly dependent on things like tourism, manufacturing and services. There's also an agricultural sector which is important, not so much in terms of its major contributions to Morocco's GDP, but instead as a kind of labour sink, proportionally not generating that much GDP relative to the number of people it employs, but it does employ a lot of people in a country where unemployment has been a persistent problem. You put that all together, and in 2025, on paper, Morocco had a GDP worth about $180 billion US, roughly $4,800 per capita. In purchasing power parity terms, that was somewhat higher, around $430 billion equivalent, roughly $11,400 per person, which establishes the country as a lower middle income economy, albeit one with relatively low inflation, 1.2% in 2025, and a central government debt to GDP ratio, roughly equivalent to a country like Germany. A key factor here is that while Morocco doesn't have those oil and gas reserves that have helped power the Algerian economy, history and geography have provided it with a couple of advantages to underpin its economy. For one, while it may not have oil, it does have phosphate. And I just want to be clear here, you might be hearing me say that they have a lot of phosphate, but what I'm actually saying is they have an absolute shit ton of the stuff. Phosphate is absolutely critical to a lot of modern agriculture. Without it, the global agricultural model as we know it simply couldn't exist, and the stuff is also important for things like battery production as well. And according to the US Geological Survey, more than 2/3 of all global reserves of phosphate rock are found in Morocco. Morocco's mines don't actually have the highest output in the world. They come second to the People's Republic of China. The difference is Morocco has more potential room to expand that production without burning through its reserves at an unacceptable pace. Given that countries often prefer to have access to certain luxury goods like fertiliser or food for their populations, for a lot of states, that makes Morocco a useful friend to have. It's not the kind of national free money hack that massive reserves of oil and gas would be, but it is something. Its geographical position also makes it a useful logistics link, both for things like shipborne trade on the Mediterranean and also things like pipelines, with Morocco, even in the past, serving as a transit route for Algerian energy exports. Although that pipeline was shut down by the Algerians in 2021, after Madrid more or less aligned with Morocco's capital Rabat on the Western Sahara issue, which starts to touch on strategic advantage number 3. Morocco, compared to its eastern neighbour, has a bit of a different friendship group. While Algeria has historically had very close dealings with Moscow, Morocco has traditionally lent much further west. And because this is a Peruvian video, in order to understand why that's the case, we obviously have to go back several centuries. As with the Algeria episode, there's no way to do full justice to all the relevant history here, and I need to stress that I'm very much not a North Africa expert. There are a couple of notable commonalities in the history of Morocco and Algeria. They were both ruled for a period by the Romans. They were both impacted by the coming of Islam. They both became bases for corsairs and pirates that would go after ships in the Mediterranean, but in other respects, their stories diverged massively. While the Regency of Algiers fell into the Ottoman sphere, for centuries the rulers of what we would now call Morocco managed to maintain their independence. And in the late 1700s, Sultan Muhammad III made what must have seemed at the time a pretty out-there diplomatic bet. By the standards of the time, he was very much a moderniser, chasing the benefits of international trade. And so in 1777, when the American colonists were still very much in a fight against the British for independence, the Sultan decreed that American ships could freely access Moroccan ports, enjoy the privileges enjoyed by other states, and not be targeted by corsairs based in Morocco. What the Sultan clearly wanted was to establish a friendship with the Americans. The problem, given the communications and the state of US politics and government at the time, was getting the Americans to actually notice. Having made his declaration in December 1777, the Sultan then made it again in February 1778. There was then a letter sent to Benjamin Franklin offering to negotiate a treaty between Morocco and the United States, and when there was no reply, a second letter was sent in 1779. Still, as far as he could tell being left unread, more communications would be attempted into 1780. Keep in mind, at this point we are more than 2 years past the original declaration being made. The US representative in Madrid reportedly received that letter in April 1780, who eventually forwarded it on about 6 months later. Congress did write a lovely letter back to the Sultan that seemed to suggest that, yep, they would love a treaty and excellent relations, and then for a while, not much happened. Exasperated by the continued delays he was facing in trying to be friends with the US, the Sultan, in late 1784, apparently decided to get America's attention in the traditional Barbary Coast fashion. The Moroccans seized an American merchant ship, the Betsy, with the implication being the Americans could have them back as soon as they hurried up with the diplomacy already. Now, I'm absolutely not saying that if someone leaves you on red forever, the best way to get their attention is to go and commit an act of international piracy. But, in the Sultan's defence, it absolutely worked. The Betsy and its crew were released, and before you know it, we had the US-Moroccan Treaty of Friendship. This thing became active in 1786, initially for a fixed period, but it was later extended to become indefinite. Critically, though, it wasn't a military alliance, just a treaty of friendship, and in any case, the US of the 17 and 1800s was hardly a military superpower. And so while US-Moroccan friendship would persist through the centuries, it wasn't enough to protect the country from the coming of colonialism. Compared to the rising imperial powers in Europe, Morocco would struggle economically, politically, and militarily. While forced to make repeated concessions to European powers, however, it would preserve its overall independence longer than neighbouring Algeria. And when that independence was finally lost, it looked very different than the Algerian experience. Unlike Algeria, which would be formally annexed by the French and ostensibly become part of France, Morocco was instead pushed into protectorate status. Some elements, including the country's foreign policy, would be subordinated to Europe. Moroccan troops would serve in French uniform in significant numbers, including during the First World War. But a lot of Morocco's traditional governance, religious and societal structures were left in place. The sultans, for example, remained in place and retained some power, with the country essentially divided into two protectorates, the French one covering a majority of the country's area, and a Spanish protectorate focused on the country's northern coast. While the European states might have agreed on how to carve up influence in Morocco, a number of the locals were, shall we say, deeply unsatisfied with the new arrangements. That led to a number of acts of armed resistance and open warfare, and I'm going to focus on just one, the so-called Rif War. As you can see on the right there, the Rif was a region that was mostly the concern of the Spanish protectorate. The bloke on the top right there helped lead a number of Rifian tribes in acts of armed warfare against the Spanish, and despite the odds on paper, with the Rifians being both outnumbered and hilariously, hopelessly outgunned, proceeded to absolutely wreck them. In an act of absolute, unparalleled military genius, the Spanish general decided to launch an offensive from the areas of northeastern Morocco that they actually controlled, closer to the coast, and plunge a casual 130-odd kilometres into Rifian-controlled territory. That left a very long, very vulnerable ground line of communication that in many places was only held by basic makeshift blockhouses. Think perhaps a platoon of soldiers who might not have access to good communications with neighbouring positions, or even basics like water. The idea was to get to the absolutely critical Al-Hoceima Bay, but what it actually achieved was very different. The Rifians harassed and wore down the Spanish forces, to the point where the main forward concentration of Spanish troops found itself locked in skirmishes, short on ammunition and other supplies. On the 22nd of July 1921, despite on paper having the numerical advantage, the general commanding that forward Spanish force decided to attempt a withdrawal. That effort was poorly organised and basically imploded. Many of the local troops and auxiliaries deserted or even swapped sides. The main force was mostly annihilated, and then the Rifians would follow up by going after those individual blockhouse positions the Spanish had left behind, bringing the eventual Spanish casualties to an estimated 13,000 dead, compared to 800 Rifian killed and wounded, out of a starting force of north of 20,000. The Spanish lost basically all the territory they'd spent years taking, enough arms and ammunition to basically single-handedly resupply the Rifian war effort, and amongst all the other casualties, the general commanding the whole affair. The battle served as a stark reminder that European militaries were not invincible and helped contribute in a significant way to political collapse back in Spain. From there, though, the Rifians would arguably overextend. In 1925, they launched attacks on dozens of French positions, inflicting several thousand casualties. That eventually helped drag the French in as well. Unlike the Spanish, the French had actually fought in the First World War. They had a lot of equipment and experienced officers lying around, and in 1925, with the French force commanded by a bloke I'm sure you've never heard of, Philippe Pétain, the French and Spanish would launch a joint amphibious operation that would more or less turn the tide. This was basically Operation Overlord done 1920 style. The Europeans brought a small force of tanks, 3 battleships, multiple cruisers. They even brought a significant air complement and a very basic aircraft carrier to go along with all the other World War I style tools being deployed. The Rifians fought hard, but at this point the deck was just too heavily stacked. The Spanish and French protectorates would go on to survive, until another world war would break Europe again, and the newly ascendant superpowers, the Soviet Union and United States, officially weren't great fans of the old European colonial order. Roosevelt, for example, had openly spoken in favour of Moroccan independence in 1943, and the Soviets were very keen to see the old European colonial empires dismantled. There would be some resistance to the end of the protectorate. The Moroccan Sultan, Mohammed V, who had openly spoken in favour of independence in 1947, was actually exiled to Corsica along with his family in 1953. But just like a certain historical Corsican who was sent into exile, the Sultan had a bit of an I'll be back moment. Under immense pressure, the protectorates would ultimately come to an end in 1956. The newly independent Morocco was generally supportive of Algeria's quest for independence, but after that independence was achieved, points of strategic tension would bubble over. As we discussed in the Algeria episode, the two countries fought the brief Sand War over territorial claims, but an enduring strategic flashpoint that exists to this day is the clash between the two over the status of the Western Sahara. The history of this region and the disputes behind it could easily fill their own episode, but the crux of the issue is essentially that Rabat claims the Western Sahara as an integral part of Morocco, while Algeria has been a long-term supporter of the Polisario Front, who have long pushed for an independent Western Saharan state. The conflict over the future of that region has long been a defining driver for Moroccan military and diplomatic strategy. Militarily, the symbol of delineation between Moroccan and Polisario control is a roughly 1,700 mile or 2,700 kilometre sand wall that Morocco began constructing in the 1980s. while diplomatically Morocco has long pushed to try and gather more international support for its proposed future of West Saharan autonomy within the Moroccan state. A significant chunk of Moroccan security policy, then, has been as much based on diplomacy and trying to build up relationships with allies as it has been on strictly military means. Morocco sent troops to various allied and UN operations around the world and has invested a lot of political capital in its old relationship with Washington. In 2004, Washington designated Morocco a major non-NATO ally. The country later sent F-16s to support American-led efforts against ISIS. The Moroccan military regularly exercises with and cooperates with the US military, including through its annual African Lion exercises. And, reportedly under more than a little bit of US prompting, Morocco would go on to normalise its diplomatic relationships with Israel in 2020. To say that didn't do great things for the relationship between Rabat and Algiers would be a titanic understatement. But it won Morocco considerable points with the US government and also helped reshape the country's security and defence industrial relationships. You can see those relationships come through more than a little bit when you look at where Morocco has historically sourced its arms from. What you're looking at here are the CIPRI figures for 2005 through 2024, but because those can be a bit bumpy year to year, I've grouped them into 5-year blocks. As you can see, while 2005 through 2009 was relatively quiet, with only a couple of small contracts, many of which actually came from Russia, in that 2010 to 2014 period, deliveries really took off, with the overwhelming majority coming from the US, France, or the rest of Europe. I've annotated in some of the major elements that explain part of that surge, American F-16s arriving in that 2010 through 2014 period, along with French Mirages and the Frem frigate. And then for 2015 through 2019, that's mostly Morocco receiving its Abrams. Beyond just the shape of the curve, there are 3 obvious points that come out of this. That Morocco sources most of its equipment from the US or Europe, but it's also in a diplomatic position where it can source some of its equipment for other suppliers when it suits. In previous years, that was Russia. Now the role is more filled by a combination of the People's Republic of China and increasingly, recently, Israel as well. And that diversity of sourcing options may not work in the favour of Morocco's logisticians, but it does provide the country with multiple options, which might be useful when you have a military that has the kind of diverse role that Morocco's needs to have. Because if you think about the various strategic imperatives and diplomatic realities we just went through, you could argue that Morocco's requirements would pull in the direction of creating at least 2 rather different militaries. A lot of the ground forces are going to be concentrated in the Western Sahara. They're going to have to operate in an area with relatively limited infrastructure, covering a very wide area, against, in the form of Polisario, a very mobile, but not particularly heavily armed opponent. Essentially, you're talking about a lot of security, rapid response, counterinsurgency, and stability operations. But then you have a separate role of conventional military deterrence. Algeria is right there, a country with more population, more economic resources, and a lot of conventional military assets, think aircraft, submarines, missiles, that from a strategist's perspective are going to create completely different challenges and demand a very different set of capabilities to deter or defeat. One of the challenges then from the Moroccan perspective, and something that I think makes them interesting from a defence economic standpoint, is that they are confronted with those competing force design requirements, but that unlike a country like the PRC or USA that might have the resources necessary to just cover off all those different military demands, Morocco is having to design a force at a resource disadvantage. The defence economics problem here is essentially double-barrelled. Algeria already has a larger economy than Morocco, and it dedicates considerably more of it to defence spending. CIPRI estimates that in 2024 Morocco was spending about 3.5% of GDP on defence, while Algeria was closer to 8% and cranked the number even higher in 2025. In terms of the absolute difference in US dollar terms then, the gap is wide and rapidly getting wider. As you can see on the right there, in the early 2020s by CIPRI's estimates, the spending gap between the 2 countries was less than 2 to 1, with the Moroccan budget sitting around the $5 billion US dollar mark, while Algeria was spending closer to 10. By 2025 though, the Algerian figure had hit $25 billion, and the budget for 2026 looks to go even higher than that. While Morocco has increased available funding a bit, it appears to have generally made the decision, at least so far, not to really try and keep up. That's left Morocco's military budget in the same rough ballpark as countries like Finland in nominal terms, and the challenge of balancing a regional competitor with more and more of a funding advantage. So with that said, let's get into the Royal Moroccan Armed Forces, how they exist today, and what Morocco might be building towards. And for this section, I think we need to be really clear about sourcing, because the media space can be a bit of a wild west when it comes to reporting on Morocco's military. Basically, there are a lot of reports stating as fact that Morocco has ordered or received piece of equipment X, to the point where if each and every one of those claims were true, we probably wouldn't be discussing the military balance via Algeria so much as asking when Morocco is going to be invited to join NATO. The problem is a lot of these claims at best are not particularly well evidenced and perhaps more than a little premature. For example, Wikipedia says that Morocco has 60 Russian BMP-3s. As a source, that figure points to this article here from 2015, saying that in good news for Morocco's mechanised infantry regiments, the country will be acquiring 60 BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles from Russia. As a source, that article points to a Facebook page, but other reports credit the information to a Russian state media article. That article cited an official from Kurganmashzavod, the company that manufactures the BMP-3, saying that the company had received requests in relation to the potential acquisition of the BMP-3, around 2 battalions worth, from Myanmar and Morocco. And then not only did the article mention 2 separate countries without specifying how many would potentially go to each, it also reportedly included a note that formal talks on the purchase of the BMP-3 between the relevant governments had not yet formally commenced at the time. So basically, the manufacturer is saying that we might sell some BMP-3s to Morocco and Myanmar, but the governments haven't really started negotiating yet. Seems to have somehow become Morocco will receive 60 BMP-3s in some of the reporting, which became Morocco has 60 BMP-3s on Wikipedia. Suffice it to say that the people over at CIPRI who maintain a database of major international arms transfers they're able to identify have no record of that kind of sale and transfer ever happening. Nor has anyone ever released a photo of a BMP-3 serving in Morocco, nor could I see any at any Moroccan military base as I went through the satellite footage. Might a secret Moroccan BMP-3 fleet exist, potentially hanging out with the Shadow Bradleys that we'll discuss a little bit later on? Possibly. But I don't think the evidence is there. And for this episode, unless otherwise noted, I'm going to stick to the platform numbers in Military Balance 2024. I'm pretty confident that in some cases, that doesn't capture everything the Moroccan military has. But it's a consistent source we've used across videos, and so it's the one I'm going to deploy here. Even if we apply that higher standard though, the Moroccan army is hardly a small force. Military Balance credits them as having 175,000 active personnel in 2023, backed by 150,000 reservists. In terms of raw active troop counts, as we'll see in the charts a little bit later on, that actually gives the Moroccans a narrow edge over the Algerians, something that was bolstered by the reintroduction of conscription back in 2019. And when it comes to the heavy equipment counts, the numbers are seldom in Morocco's favour, but there's still a lot of metal on paper here. 700 active main battle tanks and an extra 300 MBTs and light tanks in reserve, 360 assault or reconnaissance vehicles, 240 IFVs, more than 1,200 APCs, nearly 500 cannon artillery pieces, overwhelmingly self-propelled, and 83 multiple rocket launchers. A lot of those raw figures are going to compare very favourably to what you might see from much better funded forces in North America, Europe or Asia. But, as is often the case, the details do matter here, with this being one of those forces where you can find massive qualitative gaps, even within categories. The tank fleet, for example, represents a generational cross-section of US armour design. Among other things, Morocco operates American patterns, and American patterns, but you have at least 3 other interesting elements that stand out. At the top end, Morocco's reportedly received about 220 M1A1 SA Abrams. These make up the high-end element of Morocco's armoured forces, and it's a place where the force is still expanding. Then you have a collection of tanks, about 140 in all, that have more Soviet lineage. Many of these vehicles are going to be operated by what's sometimes referred to as Morocco's Russian Brigade. As the name suggests, they use a lot of Russian or Soviet lineage equipment, and my understanding is they tend to get tapped on the shoulder a lot to play Red Force during training, given, a lot of their stuff looks awfully like what Algeria uses. Finally, alongside the M48s in reserve, the Moroccans reportedly still have some old light tanks. We're talking about more than 100 Cuirassiers, which is a light tank manufactured in Austria, with a 105mm gun and a design that dates back to the 1970s. There aren't many places in the world where very old light tanks with very limited armour protection are still kept in inventory, but remember, the Algerians are still operating their T-55s. And so in North Africa, the idea of holding on to older, lighter armoured vehicles that can still be used to provide direct fire support is apparently at least somewhat alive and kicking. Tanks need mobile infantry to support them, and globally, a lot of countries fall into one of 2 categories. There are the MTLB, BMP or BTR people, and there are M113 people. Of course, if you have money, you might instead use the Boxer, or if you speak French, the VAB, but the Moroccans are very much Team M113. The country has more than 900 M113 APCs of various kinds, including a lot of command variants, and more than 100 infantry fighting vehicles derived from the M113. An interesting point to make, though, is that unlike a lot of the other countries we've looked at, where M113 is a legacy system left over from the Cold War era, Morocco actually picked up its fleet relatively recently. Like the first Abrams, a lot of these came to Morocco within the last decade as excess defence articles from the United States. Leveraging the US EDA process has long been one of Morocco's defence procurement hacks, if you like. The program allows the US Defence Department to identify equipment that it doesn't need anymore, and then instead of paying to dispose of it, they can transfer that equipment off to allies, usually on an as-is, where-is basis. Basically the geopolitical equivalent of a Facebook marketplace listing, saying item as is, pick up only. For example, I found a 2018 entry saying Morocco had received 419 armoured personnel carriers type M113A3 with an original value of $170 million, but an adjusted value of $17 million. With the US valuing these vehicles at about $41,000 per unit, you can understand why a bunch of them might end up in Morocco or Ukraine. Are they fantastically modern or well protected? No, but modern, well-protected armoured vehicles don't tend to cost less than a brand new pickup truck. There is a bit of a dividing line within the equipment park, though. You have the heavier tracked, often American stuff, so the M1 Abrams, the M113 APC, but you also have a bunch of lighter, more mobile wheeled stuff, which in a lot of cases comes from France. The general themes here are high wheeled mobility, relatively low weight, suitability for ranging desert operations and a lot of firepower, but armour protection's semi-optional. There are about 80 of the AMX-10 RCs, which we've seen serve in Ukraine, nearly 300 armed reconnaissance vehicles, including about 200 AML-90s. You can see one of those on the top right there. It's basically an armoured car with a big gun on it, and then north of 300 French VAB APCs, serving as a wheeled armoured transport option for the infantry. That same broad theme also comes through the cannon artillery park, tracked American systems and wheeled French ones. While they have fewer towed guns, especially if you include the stuff in storage, by some measures Morocco actually has more self-propelled guns than the Algerians do. Here the split is between roughly 200 American M109s of various versions. The A5 is the primary active duty one, but there are a significant number of older model M109s, as well as 203mm M110s, either in service or, in the latter case, in storage. In terms of shells, this is overwhelmingly a 155mm force, which compared to the Algerians, who are still mostly dependent on Soviet 152 and 122, again means that all else being equal, your average Moroccan SPG should be able to fire further and hit harder than your average Algerian piece. As for how Morocco managed to afford its pretty significant park of American-built artillery, once again, excess defence articles, with the most recent entry I could find being in 2017 for 70 M109A5s plus components, maintenance and repairs, with cannon tubes, for a total adjusted value of $3.2 million US. So approximately $46,000 per vehicle. That's not the price, strictly speaking, just how the US valued it in the EDA report, but it does demonstrate how picking stuff up at the equivalent of a military yard sale has allowed Morocco to accumulate a lot of equipment relative to its available resources. The wheeled component of the artillery has historically primarily been French, although to an extent that might be changing. Morocco has about 90 older self-propelled 155mm guns from France. You can see one in a position in the Western Sahara there. And then in more recent years reportedly contracted for 36 Caesar self-propelled guns, which you're probably familiar with from coverage of the war in Ukraine. Rumour is, however, the Moroccans had some technical difficulties with some of the Caesars they received, and in 2025 it was reported that the next SPG acquisition Morocco intends to make might actually be of wheeled Israeli Atmos self-propelled guns rather than additional French systems. For ground-based fire options with a longer range than the cannon artillery, Morocco does have some rocket artillery systems. Historically, those were mostly very short-range systems, BM-21 Grads from the Soviet Union. But Morocco now reportedly has 36 examples of the Chinese PHL-03. That's a relatively heavy 300mm system, capable of hucking rockets well past 100 kilometres. That's significant, but still well short of the reach Algeria has with its Iskanders. And so, as we'll cover a little bit later on, Morocco has been actively pursuing even more reach here. Moving on to air defence systems, at the time Military Battles 2024 was written, Morocco's were a bit of a work in progress. In the mid-range category, they had approximately 24 Tianlong 50 launchers from China, and according to CIPRI, about 150 DK-10 interceptor missiles to fire from them. That kind of magazine depth might not last particularly long in a country like Ukraine, but suffice to say Morocco's in a bit of a different threat environment. Then you have various shorter-range systems that range from the cutting edge to the very, very old. On the museum piece end of the spectrum, Morocco still has about 40 old American M48s. This is not exactly a frontline system, but even in 2025, you can potentially do a lot of damage with essentially a ground-launched Sidewinder. The higher-end option here is the vertical launch Mica system from France. This system is also currently in service with the French military and can reportedly engage targets out to about 20 kilometres. Coupled with man-portable air defence systems like the American Stinger, that gives the Moroccans access to a reasonable amount of point and short-range air defence capability against fixed-wing and rotary targets, but it would seem to leave at least two major gaps. There's no very long-range SAM, and there's not much here for ballistic missile defence. Wikipedia and a few news articles out there do claim that Morocco already has a long-range SAM, the Chinese HQ-9, basically an analogue of the Russian S-300 or S-400, but CIPRI and the IISS seem to disagree. As an extra verification step, I also found the base mentioned in this news article here, claiming that back in 2021 Morocco had opened up this site to house these new long-range Chinese air defence systems, but looking at images taken more than a year after publication didn't show any visual evidence of those systems being present. So unless or until we see something pop up in a satellite image or at a parade, or even just get confirmed by a major source like one of the countries involved, I'm going to press X to doubt here. I'll also note for completeness that Morocco has roughly 50,000 personnel across different paramilitary forces, but as with Algeria, I'm going to mostly leave these out of any force comparisons. And at a high level, that's what these comparisons look like. In terms of edges, Morocco has a lead in terms of total army manpower, a quantitative advantage in self-propelled artillery, but not artillery as a whole, and in some categories the quality of the equipment arguably peaks higher, if you will. But there are significant gaps that, as this arms race heats up, Morocco does appear to be trying to fill. Algeria has a significant quantitative advantage when it comes to armour, a ground-based fire's range advantage through its purchase of Russian Iskander tactical ballistic missiles, and Morocco's ground-based air defence systems have historically lacked higher-end anti-ballistic and long-range capabilities. So let's talk about some of the recent or rumoured purchases we've seen from Morocco, and how they might be trying to close off some of those gaps within the limits of their available resources. Starting with ground-based fires, we've seen the Moroccans push towards at least two different systems, the Israeli Pulse and the American HIMARS. Thanks to American paperwork, we know a bit more about the latter, so it's the one I'm going to focus on. The American foreign military sale notification here was for a total deal valued at about $520 million for 18 HIMARS units, 36 pods of Gimler's unitary warhead missiles, another 36 pods of the tungsten rain missiles, 40 pods of low-cost practice rockets, and 40 ATACMS tactical ballistic missiles. The two interesting notes there are that 1, Morocco appears to have gone for a 50-50 mix between conventional high explosive and the tungsten shower option when it comes to its Gimler's rockets, which might potentially reflect some experience from Ukraine where we've seen cluster and wide area munitions often be very effective. While the second observation is that depending on the version in question, ATACMS could provide the Moroccans with something in roughly the same range bracket as the export version of the Iskander. If we only count ATACMS then, that would leave Morocco at a roughly 2-to-1 disadvantage when it comes to TBM inventory, Algeria with roughly 75 Iskanders, and Morocco with around 40 ATACMS. To be fair though, based on what we've seen in Ukraine, I think it's a bit of an open question as to how much damage both sides could realistically do to each other before exhausting those inventories. Launching at the rates we've seen in Ukraine would exhaust those inventories very quickly, and so it seems likely that both sides would have to reserve those kind of high-value munitions for only very high-value targets. In terms of bulking out their air defences, there are plenty of Morocco procurements that have been rumoured, but only a few ones that have actually been substantiated by the metal actually turning up in theatre. The 4 batteries of French vertical launch SAMs are one example, and another is the Israeli Barak. This was reported as a roughly $500 million contract back in February 2022, so a major purchase by Moroccan standards. And while the actual transfer hasn't shown up in CIPRI's data yet, because that only runs through 2024, we now have satellite images, you can see some on the right there, appearing to show Barak launches in Morocco. Another example of this being the 21st century, and this kind of stuff just being hard to hide. It's a vertical launch system, like the French Mica or the SAMP-T, but more like NASAMS, its capability really come down to what interceptor you're choosing to fire from it. So depending on what exact missiles the Moroccans have sourced for these launches, and there are competing reports on that point, it might represent the country's military extending its surface-to-air missile range bracket and also getting its first ABM capabilities. At least in that case, even if we don't know the missile inventory though, we have confirmation of the acquisition of the system, which is more than I can say for the next big question mark. Reports that Morocco is trying to acquire the American Patriot system. Patriot doesn't really need any introduction. The Americans have used it extensively, we've seen it deployed in Ukraine, and it's one of those systems that could potentially address both those gaps we identified in Morocco's air defence systems. With the PAC-2 interceptor, Patriot would allow Moroccan air defenders to fire further, and with PAC-3, it would give them an option proven against incoming ballistic missiles. Patriot has been rumoured to be on Morocco's wish list for a long time, and recent reports suggest that an example of the system might have been sent to Morocco for potential testing or evaluation. But as a warning, I'd be careful about reading too much into some of this coverage. Back in 2021, some sources, usually quoting each other, claimed that Morocco had actually already purchased Patriot. This one here, for example, said the US Trade Department disclosed the sale of Patriot missiles to Morocco in December, and it provided a source in the form of a link to a US government website, which, as far as I can tell, doesn't actually mention Patriot. I went back to an archived version of the site that existed in 2021, so several months after that article was posted, and while it mentions a bunch of other American products on various pages, F-16s, AH-64s, I couldn't find a single reference to Patriot. Although maybe that's just because they already had them. I found some other articles claiming they purchased Patriot back in 2019, and then presumably went on to hide them in a bunker somewhere alongside the BMP-3s. More seriously, as far as I can tell, there's no public foreign military sale information on Patriots going to Morocco, and so I suspect this is more a case of interest than a confirmed purchase. The Moroccans are probably looking at Patriot because it's a proven system, and especially as the Algerians buff up their air force, it would answer a lot of their requirements. But if you're expecting Morocco to stack up multiple batteries of the thing next week, I'd be cautious. The problem with Patriot systems and interceptors as an answer for a country like Morocco is that there just aren't enough of them. Ukraine wants them, multiple cashed-up European and Middle Eastern states want them, the US military itself wants them, and has chewed through a number of interceptors in various operations, and that leaves a country like Morocco in a difficult position when it comes to competing on things like delivery priority or price. The chance of Patriot radars, launchers or missiles turning up through the EDA program are basically zero. Unlike its tanks, its APCs or its artillery, Morocco's not going to be able to get these things from US surplus for cents on the dollar. The option of purchasing them outright and then just joining the delivery queue is obviously still open, but given the scale of the Moroccan defence budget, even a battery or two of Patriot would take a significant chunk out of the procurement budget and potentially force them to make choices elsewhere. Choices like, for example, cutting back on their plans to modernise and expand the tank force. In that respect, first let me tell you what we think we know, and then what we don't. Most sources out there agree that Morocco's plan is to build up the Abrams force to close to 400 main battle tanks. They tend to agree that initially Morocco got more than 200 Abrams, and that recently it's been getting more Abrams. What they don't agree on is what kind. As you can see on the right there, some of the coverage suggests that the tanks Morocco has been getting in this second batch are the latest and greatest of US armour design, the M1A2 SEP V3. This would arguably be a pretty big deal, a major qualitative jump over a lot of the stuff in Algerian inventory, and particularly critical on the modern battlefield, the SEP 3 version of the American Abrams has an active protection system. It integrates trophy, which means it has a much better answer to threats like ATGMs or small UAS that are so common on the modern battlefield. As far as the actual evidence goes, though, a lot of sources seem to suggest otherwise. The news release from the US Defense Security Corporation organization doesn't talk about new build M1A2 SEP V3s. It talks about Morocco wanting to spend about $1.26 billion upgrading 162 tanks obtained through excess defense articles. The document had said Morocco wanted to upgrade 162 tanks to one of the following variants: the M1A1 SA, the M1A2M, or the M1A1 US Marine Corps version. For their part, the SIPRI database suggests these are probably going to be more M1A1 SAs as opposed to M1A2 SEP V3s. And while Rabat has released plenty of videos and images of Abrams turning up at various Moroccan military exercises, so far there hasn't been a single SEP V3 in sight. So at this stage, I think it's reasonable to assume that the Moroccans are building up the quantity of their force and continuing to modernise by switching more and more over to the Abrams, but they haven't been able to throw so much money at the problem that they achieve a major qualitative lead and can benefit from things like APS. And after one more example, I'm going to stop harping on this issue because by now you probably get the point. Some of the coverage out there on Moroccan defence acquisitions is a bit speculative. That doesn't necessarily mean it's untrue, plus mistakes can absolutely happen, and I'd expect one or two to slip into this video. But some of these claims just don't seem to have a huge amount of hard evidence behind them. A final example would be something like this one, with the AI search result confidently telling me here that Morocco is going to be receiving US Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, with hundreds of new Bradleys expected to be received through the Excess Defence Articles program to operate alongside those new M1A2s. Articles like this one from 2024 suggested Morocco had already received 500 of the things. Wikipedia settles for suggesting that Morocco has fewer than 500 Bradleys merely on order. In either case, though, this would have been a massive news story for a variety of reasons. For the capabilities of the Moroccan ground forces, it would be transformational. And it would also have been a massive slap in the face to another country that was trying to get its hands on Bradleys at the time, Ukraine. The best estimates suggest that Ukraine, over the course of the war, has received a bit more than 300 Bradleys from the United States. The vehicle is highly valued there and has generally performed well. If there were an extra 500 Bradleys just lying around that America was trying to get rid of through EDA, you'd have to imagine that Kyiv would be pretty keen to get their hands on them. It would, frankly, be a bit of a geopolitical scandal, if, that is, it actually happened. The EDA database does lag. We don't have data items for 2024 or 2025 yet, but if these things were authorised and transferred in 2023, you'd expect to see them in the data. So I went through it, all of it. When it comes to EDA, the US itemises just about everything. So pity the poor sod who had to do the paperwork on transferring a single buckle valued at $6.37 to Morocco in 2023. There is a lot of stuff in here. Tens of thousands of M16s, nearly 1,000 40mm grenade launchers, more than 1 million rounds of rifle ammunition. There are Abrams tanks, M113s, shotguns, trucks, 50 cal ammunition, but no Bradleys. If they do eventually become available under EDA and other allies don't pounce first, I'm sure Morocco would probably go for them. But what seems more likely, at least in the short to medium term, is Morocco going for some potentially more affordable options that might have some potential for production localisation. That's made Morocco a customer for things like Indian infantry fighting vehicles. Because as long as you're willing to ignore the collective groans from the maintainers, who now have to deal with yet another family of vehicles coming into Moroccan inventory, the Indians were willing to offer an armoured platform at a competitive price that will be assembled in a new facility in Morocco, with the initial goal being 35% Moroccan components, eventually pushing towards 50%. The core point here is that Morocco has set a lot of goals for army modernisation by 2030, a refresh of the equipment park, expansion of the domestic defence industrial base, and the acquisition of new high-value capabilities that close some of those gaps compared to the Algerians. But resource constraints mean that a lot of the time, they're going for more affordable options like excess defence articles from the United States, and only going for the premium option, which is buying new build state-of-the-art kit when it's something that's very high priority with the right price tag. A lot of those themes that come through looking at the Moroccan army also apply to the Royal Moroccan Air Force. A lot of legacy French and American military equipment, with a procurement budget that necessarily has to be very focused. In personnel terms, this is the second largest of the Moroccan services, with about 13,000 active duty personnel, operating about 70 fighter and multi-role aircraft, as well as supporting transports, tankers and enablers. Compared to a lot of the other forces out there you might use as a comparison, there are parts of the inventory that are doing relatively well. There's a decent strategic airlift capability with about 17 medium transport aircraft, mostly C-130s, and Morocco is one of the few countries out there with a dedicated, albeit small, air refuelling capability, with the Air Force operating 2 KC-130s, which is the tanker version of the Hercules. If you look at the combat aircraft themselves, though, the quality becomes a bit more variable. The fighter force is divided into 3 main segments. Around 23 F-16s, 25 Mirages from France, and about 22 of the comparatively ancient Northrop F-5s. That's a light fighter design that first entered US service back in the 1960s, with Morocco receiving its more modern versions of the airframe in the 1980s. They have gone through some modernisation, but as a general rule, you'd hate to put an airframe like that up against a modern Sukhoi, for example. With only so much available to spend on the airframes themselves, we've seen Morocco try and compensate to some extent by applying the right bells and whistles. Morocco's F-16s have access to a pool of relatively modern munitions, small diameter bomb, C-model AMRAAMs, as well as support equipment like what you can see here hanging off the wing, which is an American sniper targeting pod. Morocco purchased these for their F-16s, I think, back in 2009, boosting the awareness of those aircraft and also allowing them to use various laser-guided munitions. Because if you want to use something like an APKWS guided rocket, for example, you need to be able to laser the target, and a sniper pod is one of the preferred ways of doing that. The total announced value of the contract was only $30 million, albeit in 2009 terms. So Morocco didn't have to pay that much in order to give the jets that it did have a bit of a boost. Looking forward though, if you're trying to assess the balance between Morocco and Algeria, the Air Force arguably has more reason to be pessimistic about the current situation than the Army. Algeria's fighters are more numerous, there's a bit of a qualitative gulf between the mainline fighter, the Sukhoi 30 MKI, and some of the Moroccan inventory, especially those F-5s, and it looks increasingly like that qualitative gap might be in the process of getting worse. On this channel, I've sometimes been critical of Russia's 5th-generation fighter candidate, the Sukhoi 57, but that kind of criticism is always going to be relative. Sukhoi 57's capabilities, its development schedule, its production volumes, those are all pretty questionable if you're comparing it to the likes of F-35, F-22, or the Chinese J-20. But start comparing them to older model F-16s or Mirages, or heaven forbid, F-5s, and suddenly the thing's going to look a lot more dangerous. Algeria claims that it's already received its first felons, and we also have satellite imagery appearing to show another type of Russian fighter, the Sukhoi 35, on an Algerian airbase as well. In short, the Moroccan Air Force was already outnumbered in the skies, and with these upcoming deliveries, the quality balance might be shifting in the wrong direction as well. There are other areas where the Moroccan inventory looks a bit healthier compared to both their requirements and their competitors. The Moroccan transport helicopter fleet, which has to support military mobility in the Sahara, includes 10 Chinook heavy-lift helicopters. That's a fairly niche, high-value capability that a lot of militaries don't have, and which means the Moroccans can, at least on a limited scale, airlift some heavier military equipment by helicopter. Next, we have to talk drones and loitering munitions. The Moroccans have various Israeli ISR drones and loitering munitions, a small number of heavier Chinese reconnaissance drones, but the most notable entry in the force is probably the Bayraktar TB2, with the Moroccans reportedly having about 19 examples. The TB2 gained a lot of fame in Ukraine for slapping a lot of Russian forces in the earlier stages of the invasion. After the Russian air defense systems got their act together though, these drones mostly retreated from frontline areas. For a nation like Morocco though, that kind of vulnerability is probably secondary. Suffice to say, Polisario's armed forces aren't sitting on a massive stockpile of S-300s, books and tours. So for a lot of use cases, the TB2 gives Morocco something that is relatively affordable, while providing the utility of being armed and carrying a reasonable sensor package. Morocco also has a small but sovereign space-based reconnaissance capability. They have 2 reconnaissance satellites currently in service, launched in 2017 and 2018 respectively, although both are now coming towards the end of their intended design lifespan. If we go back to the airframe counts, however, in quantitative terms, Morocco's at a significant disadvantage. Algeria has the deeper bench when it comes to fighters. There's no direct Moroccan equivalent to Algeria's Sukhoi 24s, and with these being MB 2024 figures, they also don't capture some of Algeria's more recent acquisitions. The Moroccan force clearly does have some strong points. Drones, space-based reconnaissance, and some good munitions for the aircraft they do have. The C-model AMRAAMs in Moroccan inventory, for example, are going to have a lot of regional lethality compared to a lot of the other missiles in service across Africa. But there are at least 2 asterisks here. One, Morocco's quality assets aren't always available in great quantities, and secondly, the quality available is inconsistent. The 2009 order for AMRAAMs, for example, was only for 30 missiles. Enough for a couple of engagements, but few enough that pilots would either need to be very conservative with their munitions, or highly reliant on another AMRAAM user out there resupplying Morocco in a crisis. In that sense, Morocco might believe they can economise a bit on their munitions buys, but gain experience maintaining the weapons, having them in inventory, and having a small supply ready for action if necessary. The obvious risk, of course, is that if resupply doesn't come quickly in a crisis, then you better hope your pilots have watched Top Gun 2 and feel good about trying to get gun kills on Sukhoi 57s. Because if they, or even just Sukhoi 35s, start making their way into Algerian inventory with the right missiles, just having a small supply of AMRAAMs probably wouldn't be enough to maintain the balance in any hypothetical air battle. So, with those trends being what they are, what's Morocco been doing in terms of modernisation? Satellite reconnaissance is still clearly very much a priority, and one that's got the Moroccans willing to put money on the table. Last year it was reported that Rabat had struck a $1 billion deal with Israeli aerospace industries for 2 new spy satellites, which, based on the rumours and reporting so far, we can probably assume are going to be a significant step up over what Morocco's operated in the past. Still, from a Moroccan perspective though, you could argue that having those kind of ISR capabilities might be great, but it still leaves the challenge of at least trying to offset the modernisation of the Algerian Air Force. One intuitive response to the arrival of higher-tech Russian aircraft like Sukhoi 35 or Sukhoi 57 would be to bring in higher-tech Western aircraft. The rumour mill loves to attach to the prospect of Morocco potentially getting the American F-35, and you will occasionally see reports like the one on the right there claiming that there might be a discussion around potentially getting as many as 32 aircraft for a price point around $17 billion. Realistically though, if you're talking about the prospect of Morocco getting the F-35 at least within the next decade, I'd probably put it in the possible but not likely column. Politically, other countries have tried to get access to the F-35, only to run into problems with US approvals. The Turks are members of NATO, but they were kicked out of the F-35 program over their purchase of Russian S-400s. Riyadh basically has a no-limit credit card on tab for purchasing US military equipment. But it was only recently that we started to hear the White House make positive sounds about selling them F-35s. Even if political approval was forthcoming and the risks were considered manageable, there's still the financial element. F-35s themselves are actually fairly affordable aircraft, especially for what they provide. But being an F-35 operator can be very expensive business. They're famously a bit picky on maintenance, not the cheapest aircraft to maintain per flight hour, and if you're a country like Morocco, standing up an entire additional maintenance and sustainment system for a new jet isn't going to be a small undertaking. I once heard a treasurer make the comment that for a government, anything is ultimately affordable if it's enough of a priority. And to an extent, when it comes to military purchases, that's kind of true. If Morocco really, really wanted to get into the 5th generation fighter game, they could afford it. The Finnish defence budget, as we noted earlier, is in the same rough ballpark as Morocco's, and they're aiming for an F-35 fleet of 64 aircraft. So you can easily imagine Morocco trying to pursue an order, say, a third or a half that size. But it would almost inevitably suck the procurement oxygen away from a range of other priorities. And Morocco has a bunch of those. A major one that's already reached the delivery phase is getting into the attack helicopter game. And we're not talking about strapping a couple of rocket pods to a light helo and calling it a day here. At a time where many much better funded militaries are dialing back their attack helicopter procurements, Morocco's going all in on Apache. The deal was for 24 of the latest E model, options on an additional 12, and an armaments package that clearly wasn't drafted by the same bloke who came up with the 30 AMRAAMs idea. More than 600 Hellfire missiles and the same number of APKWS guided rockets, plus a bunch of support equipment, services and sensors. If you've seen some of my other videos where I've been a bit negative about the prospect of major attack helicopter investments, you might look at this and think this is a case of a country making a procurement mistake. Ultimately, it may or may not be, but it does arguably illustrate where Morocco might be focusing its priorities. A lot of concerns about the attack helicopter as an investment priority come down to questions of their survivability and cost effectiveness on very highly networked, transparent and lethal modern peer battlefields. But the Moroccans aren't about to be slugging it out with the Russians in the Donbass or preparing to go up against the PLA. And if you're operating in an environment like the Western Sahara, then what the attack helicopter gives you is a very mobile asset that can forward base, respond quickly, and which brings a lot of sensors, a lot of weapons in a very mobile package for a relatively low headcount. The attack helicopter is essentially at its best when it can bully its opponents. And so the Moroccans might consider them useful for a whole range of military operations, short of a full-scale conventional war with a neighbour. At a total package value, including the 12 optional choppers, of $4.25 billion, that's still a very expensive procurement bet, which is another reason why, without significant changes, I think something like F-35 might be a major stretch. What we're seeing instead is a much more conservatively priced option where Morocco is going all in on the aircraft it currently has, the F-16. For a total of very roughly $5 billion, the Moroccan plan is to purchase 25 new-build modern F-16s, so Block 72s, upgrade their 23 existing F-16s to that F-16V standard, and support that fleet with a stash of new equipment, weapons and support services. Even a very modern F-16 is never going to be an F-35. They're just fundamentally different aircraft. But this approach means Morocco doesn't have to spend as much, can use its existing supply chain, and is taking a relatively low-cost route to add more aircraft to the fleet without adding a new aircraft type. Whether Rabat decides to stop there though, or we see more Air Force procurements in the coming years, as the picture of what exactly the Algerians are operating with becomes clearer though, only time will tell. But for the moment, the Air Force does seem to be getting a decent amount of procurement priority. The Moroccan Navy, at least recently, not so much. While Morocco was a significant naval power through a lot of its history, modern Morocco's strategic priorities have left the Navy as the smallest of the three services. That's perhaps understandable. Submarines don't traditionally do well in desert warfare, and if your concern is things like trade lane protection in the Mediterranean or Atlantic, there are a bunch of friendly European and American navies around that have typically been pretty committed to freedom of navigation. That said, Morocco having a small fleet doesn't mean it's got no fleet. And compared to some of the other services, a significant chunk of it's already gone through modernisation. At a high level, this is a surface fleet and a surface fleet only. There are about 8,500 personnel in total, including 1,500 Marines, but there are no submarines, and the ability to actually amphibiously deploy all those Marines is comparatively limited. Interestingly enough though, the flagship of the Moroccan Navy might actually be one of the most powerful frigates in service with any African fleet. The Mohammed VI is a French FREMM frigate, complete with a French radar, a 16-cell VLS for Aster-15 surface-to-air missiles, 8 Exocet anti-ship missiles for anti-surface duty, and a full ASW suite. Ship for ship, it's probably a match for any surface warship in the Algerian fleet, but unlike a country like Egypt that operates multiple FREMMs, Morocco only has one of them. Moving down the tonnage range a bit, the Moroccans also have 3 Dutch frigates from the Sigma family, all of which were commissioned between 2011 and 2012. There are subtle differences between the ships, but at their core, they all have the same search radar, they all have 4 anti-ship Exocet missiles, and they all have the same 12-cell anti-aircraft VLS. The Sigmas and the FREMM can probably be regarded as Morocco's primary surface combatants, but they're also one of the few navies out there to deploy a very interesting type of warship for lower threat environments. The Moroccan Navy has 2 Floreal-class frigates. This is originally a French design, something that was labelled as a surveillance frigate. They're not particularly fast, topping out at around 20 knots. They're not particularly heavily armed, with only a pair of anti-ship missiles and a main gun, They don't have VLS systems, and a lot of civilian techniques were used in their construction. But thanks to all those trade-offs, they were bloody cheap. From memory, the French paid the equivalent of about $160 million non-inflation adjusted for their ships, and then in a spectacular example of mates rates pricing, reportedly offered to sell the Moroccans 2 ships for something like 50 or 60 million per. Now, yes, those are 2004 prices, but no amount of inflation adjustment is going to be able to overcome the fact that that's a very cheap warship, and the Moroccans have used them ever since to essentially take pressure off the rest of the fleet. Like Algeria, the Moroccans also have a collection of smaller patrol and coastal combatants, but only a handful of them have the kind of armament that might be useful in a major military confrontation. Compared to the Algerian Navy then, that leaves the Moroccans with 1 or 2 edges and some very obvious gaps. They do have at least one quite good multi-purpose frigate with a good sensor suite, but the obvious missing piece is any kind of submarine force. Morocco's navy is probably sufficient if what you want to do is peacetime patrol, light deterrence, maybe some light air defence. But there's absolutely no equivalent in their inventory to Algeria's Kilo-class submarines. To paraphrase a bubblehead favourite, to some people there are only 2 types of ships: submarines and targets. And Algeria has submarines. The question to ask then is, does that matter? Morocco would likely be interested in obtaining submarines if the price was right. There have long been rumours and reports in that direction, and in the absence of them, it's hard to see a naval confrontation between Morocco and Algeria being anything other than a very uphill battle for the Moroccans. But this starts to get to the fundamentals of one of the basic defence economics challenges that a lot of nations with fewer economic resources than potential competitors are always going to face. When you're the party that's behind in a potential arms race, how much investment is enough investment? Because closing the gap in every capability area is often going to be out of reach, especially if you're up against a country that's already turned the percentage of GDP meter up to Reagan plus. Trying to keep up, at least to the greatest extent possible, might make things easier for the defence planners. But there are always going to be other investments you could make instead. Redirect your resources towards the civilian economy, long-term growth, or controlling debt, and play the economic and strategic long game rather than trying to match your opponent jet for jet or tank for tank. To crystallise this issue a little, I want to read from a US government report. Quote, "The military balance between Morocco and Algeria favours Algeria. Its military establishment is superior to that of Morocco because it has more combat aircraft and better equipped ground forces. Over the long haul, its forces would be expected to win a conventional war, and in such a war, the Algerians are probably capable of taking and holding territory from Moroccan forces." It goes on to note that the Algerians are better equipped with tanks and armoured personnel carriers, that the Algerian Air Force is much larger than Morocco's, and that the Algerian Navy has more ships, including more missile boats. However, there are 2 interesting notes to add there. The first is the report also points out that despite the military balance, the logistics limitations and the terrain involved would make actually fighting a war difficult. Quote, "Neither side, however, has the logistical capability to sustain major combat operations in the border area with Spanish Sahara for more than a few weeks. As we've seen in Ukraine, just enjoying a quantitative military advantage doesn't mean it's going to be easy for you to advance and actually take ground." Oh, and as for the second point I mentioned, all of those extracts are from a CIA assessment of those 2 countries, but it's one from 1975, at a point where the military gulf between the 2 countries was arguably far wider than it was now. Algeria's advantage in tanks at that time was closer to 8-1, in APCs 6-1, artillery around 3-1, and 5-1 when it came to fighters. It was also a time when one of Algeria's main international backers, the Soviet Union, was considerably more powerful in relative terms than Russia is today, and Morocco didn't have the same alliances or relationships that it does in 2025. And yet, in the 50 years since that report was written, Algeria has never been able to convert that kind of military superiority into a decisive strategic defeat for the Moroccans. And assuming that it was never their intent to try and do so, one wonders how different the Algerian economy of today might look if just a portion of that investment had been directed towards buying terminals, trains and trucks rather than Terminators. It's a hypothetical, but you could argue Algeria would have likely been fine investing a bit less. But what's less hypothetical is the strategic outcomes that Morocco's seen, relying on its very different diplomatic and defence investment strategy. Morocco has been able to maintain de facto control of most of the Western Sahara, and the 2 haven't fought a direct war since the 1960s. The core point there is that military parity might not be necessary in order to achieve your strategic objectives. Instead, you might find that you can reach your objectives with a level of investment best described as good enough. It's also worth factoring in when you look at these kind of calculations that security threats and wars never exist in a vacuum. Morocco and Algeria might look at each other and perceive a potential military threat. But if conflict between the 2 ever were to break out, you can imagine that things like disruption of Algerian energy exports or supply chains out of Morocco might get the attention of some major military powers relatively quickly, which might make it even less likely that the relative military balance between the two sides was the deciding factor in how a conflict would play out. As I said right near the start of the episode, it's a reality of arms races that they can be easy to start and difficult to stop. Anytime a country ramps up investment, it can raise pressure on its competitors to respond. In some cases, keeping up is a survival imperative. In others, the only winning move is not to play. You do what you can, accept the risk, and hope something, like say the global oil price, eventually constrains your opponent's spending. For decades, Morocco has tried to strike that balance within the limits of their available economic resources. The big question now, going forward, is how will Rabat try and strike that balance between civilian and military investment in the coming years, as the Algerian defence investment line goes dramatically up, and the capability balance potentially begins to shift. And okay, channel update to close out here. You'll hopefully forgive me if I keep it brief, given it's been a dramatic and tragic day over here in Australia. I wanted to do this video sooner rather than later because realistically I considered the Algeria episode somewhat incomplete without also looking at Morocco. It's also a good example, I think, of a country with a very different strategic context and very different resource picture than a lot of the countries we would normally look at. I want to stress at the end though at least two things. One, this region is a lot more complicated than just the defence-focused issues that I chose to look at today. I barely scratched the surface of some of the history here, and the detective work of trying to separate what the Moroccans or Algerians are actually purchasing, as opposed to what's merely rumour, is a rabbit hole that absolutely could have consumed a lot more airtime. As it is, I'm hoping I found the right balance, and that you found the episode useful. In terms of broader channel updates, two small things. Firstly, after some feedback, I've started to adjust the style on my chart slightly to try and accommodate people who might have certain types of colour blindness. I left one using the older red-green colour scheme in the start of the episode as a control, and I'll continue taking feedback and tweaking them further as we go along. I also want to flag that a lot of the time I'll receive very interesting feedback, often by email, after an episode comes out. Last week's episode on the Constellation class was absolutely no exception, and so I'm in the process of trying to bring together that feedback, some responses to it, and then I'll try and bring those responses and some further commentary on them into a relevant episode in the near future. I'll hold any further updates over until next week, and so for the moment, just thank you all of you once again for your ongoing support and engagement. And for those of you over in Sydney tonight, or indeed anywhere in the world facing loss or tragedy, please take care, stay safe, and know that I'm wishing all of you the very best.